call me?
Oh, okay. So, Alan, first of all, after all that has been said about you, I think there's not much I can add, just to say that I am very happy to have the opportunity to meet you again, as we met because we met before. But I think perhaps the true pleasure will come with the opportunity to cross-examine both the top criminal lawyer in the world and my boss. So, we'll start with the questions, and hope there will be interesting answers. And we cannot start, I think, a debate today without saying something or asking something about the agreement with Iran. And Alan, you were quoted as saying, and I'm not sure if you indeed said these words, but that the Obama administration was naive and had possibly made a cataclysmic error of gigantic proportions in its deal to ease sanctions on Iran in exchange for an opening up of the Islamic Republic's nuclear program. And I want to ask both of you, what do you think are the key problems with the agreement, maybe? What are the achievements? And do you think that the agreement might be viewed as legitimizing in any way the Iranian nuclear program? Please.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you all for coming and honoring me in this way. I appreciate it very much. Let me be very clear. I don't need to be honored. I do this from my heart. I have done it all my life. I will continue to defend the State of Israel. I do it with enormous pleasure, even though it is often very difficult and results in much criticism. I want to thank the people who put this together, particularly Danny Grossman, who conceived of this from the beginning. Obviously, I want to thank Minister Livni, who I think is doing an incredible job in terms of trying to perform an impossible task or a very, very difficult task in creating a negotiating situation where at least the possibility of peace is put on the table. I want to thank my dear friend, Justice Eliakim Rubinstein, who I've known for so many years since he was a student at Harvard, for your brilliant and informative presentation and for your kind words. And, of course, General Yadlin, whose work I use in all of my classes. You might think that I would use his brilliant essay with Professor Kasher only in my classes on preemption, because he's written about cost-benefit analysis in terms of attacking terrorism when you know there are possible civilian casualties. But I also use it in my general philosophy and jurisprudence classes, because it's the best piece ever written, applying traditional cost-benefit analysis to a complex situation with ongoing costs and benefits and changing Bayesian approaches to the problem. It's an absolute brilliant contribution, not only to military justice and law and philosophy, but generally to how one approaches complex problems. Having said that, let me turn to the specific question of Iran. First, I want to praise President Obama and Secretary Kerry for trying to have a diplomatic approach. We all know diplomacy is preferred to war, as Winston Churchill, who certainly understood the risks of diplomatic resolutions of the kind that Chamberlain accepted. But Churchill said, war, jaw is better than war. We all understand that. And if we look at the Syrian situation, the Obama administration, quite by accident, backed itself into a wonderful resolution where the Syrians are giving up their chemical weapons without a shot having been fired. I think everybody in this room would agree that the goal of our approach, the United States approach, Israel's approach, would be, if it's possible, to bring about a cessation of Iran's nuclear weapons program, which of course they are undertaking, without a shot having to be fired, and even without sanctions, if the end result would be to bring Iran into the international community, to have them end their support for Hezbollah, to stop them from being a rogue nation, and to bring them back to a situation where the international community accepts them. That would be the perfect solution. I think there's about a 10% chance of that happening. President Obama thinks there's a 50-50 chance. I'm not sure he thinks that, but certainly that's been his public position. The one thing we know for absolute certain is that we know nothing for absolute certain about Iran's state of mind. We are guessing. We don't know whether or not the supreme leader of Iran has put Iran in the front with a nice smiling face in order to conceal from the world his intentions, which haven't changed, that is to develop nuclear weapons aimed at Israel, to create a nuclear umbrella under which terrorism can operate, to hang a sort of Damocles over Israel, to encourage Yeridah, many people leaving Israel for fear of a nuclear possible attack. Do I think that's the most likely scenario? Yes, I do. There are two other possible scenarios. One, maybe there are pressures within Iran and the supreme leader has changed his mind and understood that the United States and Israel have given him two options. Number one, end the nuclear program, or number two, lose your regime. And he thought that he'd prefer not to lose his regime, and so he's changed his mind. Possibility, I put that at about 1%. Then I think there's another possibility, namely that there's an internal struggle going on. Unlikely in Iran, we haven't seen that before, but the Revolutionary Guard seems to be critical of the deal, and there are some elements within Iran that are favorable. We do know that although elections aren't real in Iran, there was some popular uprising in the street, and maybe there is a process going on, and the issue then would be how best to influence that process in the right direction, whether by maintaining the sanctions, increasing the sanctions, maintaining a credible military threat, is better than making a deal of the kind that was made. My own view is that maintaining the military option and keeping the sanctions was a better way of influencing that outcome than the deal we have now made. I think Iran has gotten what they want from the deal. What they have gotten in their mind, they may be wrong about it, but in their mind, is the beginning of the end of the sanctions process. They're going to be relieved of somewhere between $8 and $22 million of immediate sanctions, but China is already there in Tehran seeking business. Other countries are there seeking business. They see the end of the sanction regime. The words may not be that, but the music is clearly in that direction. What have they had to give up in exchange? They haven't had to give up their building of rockets, which are capable of carrying nuclear weapons. And you might ask the question, why are you developing rockets capable of carrying nuclear weapons if you deny having a nuclear weapons program? Number one. Number two, there has been no slowing down of the building of centrifuges and the spinning and the ability to develop a civilian capacity which is easily transferable to a military capacity, and no ceasing of the heavy water plant and process. So the Iranians see this as a victory. That's very, very clear. And I think the difference is not between American and Israeli intelligence assessments. I think the intelligence assessments are essentially the same. I think the big difference is America is many thousands of miles away, is not at immediate risk. Therefore, it can place hope over fear. Israel, which is so close and is the intended target of any nuclear program, has to place fear over hope. And so there are reasonable differences. In my autobiography, I write that where one stands is a function of where one sat and who one sat next to. And I would add to that, how one stands on the threat of a nuclear program is a function of where one sits in relation to where the threat is. So I think we see a reasonable disagreement. Having said that, I think it was a mistake. I think it was a serious mistake. It has a potential for success, but the potential for failure is greater than the potential for success. We should stop looking backward and start looking forward and see what the United States and Israel can do together over the next 6 months to increase the possibility of a good deal. After all, one of Iran's goals, one of the very important Iran's goals, was to create a gulf between Israel and the United States, or to increase the gulf. They have succeeded in that direction. They have succeeded for a lot of reasons. There's been a lot of public criticism by Israel. By the way, the White House appreciates some of that. I think there is an understanding in the White House that good cop, bad cop, Israel being very, very tough, being critical of the United States, probably helps the United States in its negotiating posture, but the question is one of degree. And so I think right now the issue is how to narrow the gulf, how to get the least worst deal as a end of 6 months, and what to do in the very likely event that at the end of 6 months there will be no deal. My great fear, and then I'll stop, my great fear is that the Obama administration may have a different goal than Israel long term. And that is, the Obama administration might be satisfied by kicking the can for the next 3 years. That is, by making sure that Iran doesn't develop a nuclear weapon on President Obama's watch. I sat next to President Obama as close as I'm sitting to you, Pnina, and he looked me in the eye and he said, Alan, you know me. You've known me for a long time. I don't bluff. I am telling you, looking you in the eye, Iran will not develop a nuclear bomb on my watch. I have Israel's back. And he was very clear about that, and I was very clear in saying, Mr. President, as you sit here now looking at me, I believe you. You're telling me the truth. You're telling me what you believe now. But I don't know what you will believe in a year or 2 years when Iran gets close and the decision has to be made. Who knows what sabers will be rattled by China or by Russia or by Congress? You're not in a position to keep that promise. And that's why you can't ask Israel to outsource the defense of its civilians to another country. And I reminded him, as I have in print, of Elie Wiesel's famous lesson from the Shoah: always believe the threats of your enemies over the promises of your friends. And that's why Israel must always maintain an independent capacity to take whatever action is necessary. Now, I know we have in the audience one of my heroes, the former head of the Mossad, Mr. Halevi, who I admire enormously, and he has said publicly that he thinks that it would be a mistake for Israel to unilaterally, I hope I have you correct, unilaterally take a decision at the point you made that statement, it was a while ago, to take military action. But I think he has also said publicly that keeping the military option on the table, particularly a joint military option with the United States and with Israel, is essential. I support that view, and we all hope that the military option doesn't have to be deployed. Right now, Iran does not believe there is a military option. Right now, Iran's state of mind is that America will not employ the military option, that Israel needs a green light from the United States to deploy it, and that Israel will not get that green light. I think they are wrong in the latter assessment. I don't believe Israel thinks it needs a green light from the United States. I think people who think that will be very surprised if it becomes necessary. That doesn't mean I think the military option will be deployed. But the next year is going to be a crucial year in the history of American-Israel relations, in the history of Israel, in the history of Israel's relations with Iran. We're going to see an end, we haven't talked about this yet, of the 9-month pregnancy process of the peace talks with Tzipi Livni leading the peace talks. We're going to see the expiration of the 6-month period, which may end in an abortion, and a late-term abortion, which is always very unhealthy. And none of us can predict, as we sit here today, what the outcomes of those two very important processes are and how they are, if any way, linked together. So that's my brief answer to your question.
Thank you.
The defense has no questions. About the agreement. I'm taking the advice of Supreme Court judge. I'm never in panic and never in euphoria.
Right.
This agreement is not an historic failure and not an historic achievement. It's a 6 months agreement that has to enable, maybe we can achieve the 5%, because it's always preferred, of course, to have an agreement and not let the Iranians have the bomb or go to the bombing. If we can achieve a third option, it's better. I share your 5% chances, but even if you go to a military intervention, and the name of this evening is legitimation and legitimacy, you must submit an offer that the Iranians should reject to get legitimacy to the military option. Before you go to military option in a democratic country, you do need to ask yourself all the tough questions. I have a list of 35. I will not go through all of them. But we have to ask at least 4 fundamental questions. First of all, can you can you do it? Because if you cannot do it, the other 34 are not important. Second, and this is a very tough question, what is more dangerous for Israel? An Iranian with the bomb, or bombing Iran, and later on, it is not going to be like 81 or 2007. There will be an Iranian reaction. So, what is more dangerous to Israel? The Prime Minister is not hesitating a second. The bomb is more dangerous. There is other thinking about it, and it's not, I'm hesitating more than a second before I join him. I have to think about it about a month, or even more. I'm doing it in the last 5 years to decide what is better. But this is the second. So if you decide that the bomb is more dangerous, you go to the next question, and once again, do you have legitimacy to do it? Will the rest of the international community will recognize it as a legitimate self-defense move? And Pnina is working on it, and she is saying it's not sure that the international law will say that this is self-defense. Because the main problem is that they don't have the bomb yet. You know, even attacking Syria, after they have killed 1,500 of their own citizens with chemical weapon, the lawyers said that attacking Syria is not legitimate. It's not according to the international law. So we will come to the difference between international law and legitimacy, but it's an issue. And then you have to ask, what is the opinion of your greatest ally, sometimes your only ally, the United States of America? You're absolutely right that we never ask for a green light. Never. If we feel that we have to do it, we will do it. But if the red light is burning here, it's a serious consideration.
Sure.
And if the agreement will fail, I think the red light will become yellow. It will never be green.
Right.
About the agreement itself. The agreement itself is not necessarily all bad. I have some good news in the agreement. First of all, for the first time after 10 years, the Iranians are stopping the program. They are stopping the program. I very much not in love in where they are. They reached to 19,000 centrifuges, 12,000 of them spinning. They have enough fossil material for 4 or 5 bombs. And they are almost operating a heavy water reactor in Iraq. So they're stopping it. If they are now 4 to 6 months from the bomb, they will be going backward a week. But they are not going forward. And the 20%, and if you remember our Prime Minister drawing a line, it was on the 20%.
Right.
The 20% is going to zero now.
Right.
So there will be a better inspection, and the sanction regime, according to those who signed the agreement, I heard last weekend in Washington, I'm not sitting near the president, but I was in the same room, when he says that I'm going to make sure that the sanction regime is not going to collapse. Maybe Alan is right, maybe the president is right. We have to see it in the next 6 months. So this is the good news. The bad news is that they got the permission to enrich. In contrary to the UN Security Council resolutions, 4 of them, that basically told them, it's not the Prime Minister of Israel who says stop all enrichment. It's the UN Security Council resolutions. This agreement haven't touched anything that has to do with the military dimension of the program, that the Iranians don't admit that exists, but we all know it exists. And there is, of course, the danger that this permanent agreement, like many permanent issues, will become the final, the comprehensive agreement, because will solve the problem of everybody but Israel. The Iranians will be happy with this agreement. The Americans will be happy with this agreement, and it's because they will not be able to reach another agreement, and they will not seek a confrontation. It will stay extended another 6 months and another 6 months. When the Prime Minister said it's a very bad deal, I said it's an acceptable deal for 6 months. Mm-hmm. If it's become the comprehensive deal, it's a very bad deal. Mm-hmm. Last but not least, I totally agree that we have now to put this agreement behind us and work very hard on the parameters of the comprehensive agreement. Mm-hmm. And if this agreement have stopped the Iranians and took them back a week, a month from the bomb, we have to take them years back from the bomb. And this can be done only if all the activities that they are doing today that is aimed into a military nuclear bomb will be eliminated, and anything that they will be given will be civilian and with limited number of centrifuges, with all the stockpile going out of Iran, stockpile of enriched uranium. And the president already said that Fordo and Arak should be closed. So the contour of the deal that will take them years backward from the bomb is there. The will to negotiate on this and to press the Iranians to this place, I'm not sure exists there. Mm-hmm. Because we may lose the only two leverages that we have against the Iranians, and this is a very tough sanction regime and a credible military option. And these two are in danger to be eroded in the next 6 months. So I will close with saying that we are facing a crucial year, the 6 months of the agreement that, by the way, haven't yet in effect. They are still working on the technical issues, the peace process, and also the issue of the chemical weapon in Syria, because it was agreed at the eve of Yom Kippurim, but I said on television that we will see only in Chag Bikurim whether the chemical weapon really went out. So it's all going to late summer, to late spring, early summer.
Can I briefly respond? Okay. I agree with 3 of your 4. I want to make a very strong point about one of them, and that is international law. I urge the State of Israel not to base its decision on existing international law. As Dean Acheson once said, no country's survival has ever been made to depend on international law. International law in this regard is anachronistic. It's out of date. It was never viable. Let me give you an example. If Winston Churchill had made the decision in 1937 to attack Nazi Germany because they were building up an arms system capable of destroying all of Europe, they would have been in violation of international law, and it would have been the right thing to do. And the United States, when it had mutually assured destruction with the Soviet Union as its Cold War goal, you attack New York, we'll attack Moscow, was in clear violation of international law. You're not allowed to bomb civilian targets in retaliation for the bombing of your civilian targets. International law, with all due respect to Pnina, is a construct in the mind of a bunch of left-wing academics. There is no basis for international law in any reality. It's not based on legislation. Much of it is not based on treaty. It is the ultimate exercise in elitist non-democracy. And if it makes sense, then it should be followed. The Israeli Supreme Court has done a very good job in bringing it into a realistic sense. The 2 decisions, one of which referred to by Justice Rose, was the decision about the security fence. That was a application of international law contextually to a realistic situation. The decision about targeted killing by Justice Baruch, likewise. But if you applied literal international law to either of those problems, literal international law, you'd get to an extremely unjust result. How do you go about making decisions of this kind? It's very, very complex. Let me give you an example again to go back to Winston Churchill. We know Winston Churchill favored diplomacy. We know he would not have given up the Sudetenland for peace in our time. We don't know whether he would have actually attacked if he had been prime minister. But if he had been the prime minister and had attacked as Goebbels thought he would in his diaries, and had killed the entire Nazi regime, destroyed the entire Nazi party, and in the process killed 10,000 innocent German civilians, he would go down in history as a butcher, a barbarian, and the paradigm of the violation of international law. And yet he would have saved 50 million lives. But nobody would have known that. Why? Because history is blind, deaf, and dumb. It doesn't understand contingencies. It doesn't understand the future. It doesn't understand what would happen if Israel were to, or the United States were to have to take the decision as a last resort to destroy Iran's nuclear weapons. Nobody could know what it would have prevented. That's not a case or an argument for doing it. It's an argument for Pnina continuing her research on international law, for writing the best possible brief. And by the way, I have urged the Israeli government now, not a year from now, not 2 years from now, or to international scholars, to prepare a brilliant, creative brief showing how international law has changed. Remember, too, that the Security Council Article 51 wouldn't even have permitted Israel to attack in 1967 preemptively. As the result of Israel's attack in 1967 and other factors, the UN appointed a commission to relook at Charter 51, and they said preemptive wars are justified under international law in violation of the language of the Charter article. They said as to preventive wars, it's a very hard question, and it is a hard question. But if it comes to nuclear weapons and your survival, at least you can make the case for it. Now, the argument that international law would prohibit an attack because they don't yet have a bomb shows the absurdity of international law. It shows the stupidity of international law in not recognizing that you cannot attack a government once it has a nuclear bomb. Look at North Korea. Look at Pakistan. You must attack, if you're going to attack, a nuclear weapons program before the nuclear weapon is developed. Otherwise, you'll cause enormous environmental damage. And international law doesn't recognize that because of who wrote it. And that's why I think, realistically, all the other factors that you've taken into account must be considered. But I cannot imagine any rational government making a decision on its own survival based on a bunch of academics sitting in the Sorbonne deciding in ivory towers what international law should be in a society of perfect beings, that if men were angels and women were angels, we would exist. And that's not the way international law works today. And I'd be very interested to hear Pnina's views on that.
You take my time.
Okay, I will. I think that international law is important and is essential in regulating what countries do and how they behave. But I think there's a big difference between different spheres in which the international law operates. And I agree that when we talk about what we term as jus ad bellum, the laws of when is it lawful to use force in the relations between states, here I think we call it international law, but it's really international relations. The Charter, Article 2.4, you mentioned Article 51, these are rules of governing how states should behave between themselves, when should they use force and when shouldn't they. And here I agree that the law, it is important to understand it, it is important to develop it, but that will not be and should not be the decisive argument, or the decisive reason whether to use force or not. And I think in this case, when it comes to these kinds of decisions, especially when it's an existential threat, there is a possibility there is a flexibility, an inherent flexibility in the rules that apply to these kinds of decisions. We saw it after 9/11. When the law became very flexible with regards to understanding self-defense against non-state actors. I think we will see the same with regard to nuclear threats. But the way is by developing the law, and there's a whole notion of the last window of opportunity that is being developed, and I think that's the good way forward. Not to say the law isn't relevant, but to say the law has to be implemented in a way that meets the necessities of reality. If it becomes divorced from reality, then it becomes irrelevant. I do think that I would very hesitate to say that it's not relevant at all, because then that might be understood as it is not relevant at all also in other situations where I think it is relevant, because when we are talking about not the relations between states, but the relations between states and civilians, for example, their rights, there I think the law has a very important role, including international law, and I don't want to see that role eroded by a general concept of the law being unsuitable or not relevant. So, and here I think, and maybe I would ask this also as a question, I think one of the dilemmas we have is in fighting asymmetric conflicts when we're trying to use the laws that they use in bail, or the laws that apply during warfare. And here I think that the legal framework is much more relevant than in the other cases of use ad bellum, but still we have a lot of dilemmas between ethics and law, between legality and legitimacy, and I would like to hear your views also maybe about that. We don't have much time, but I think there's a different role that law plays in these two areas. I would like to hear what do you think about that.
Well, I disagree. I think the law regarding how you fight asymmetrical warfare is even less relevant than the law regarding how wars begin. Let me give you an example. There are now 100,000 rockets aimed at Israel from Hezbollah, and we know Hezbollah's policy. Hezbollah has put these rockets in civilian homes. Their homes in some of the Shia villages have a living room, a bathroom, a bedroom, and a rocket room. And they're right next to each other, and they're designed to put Israel into a terrible dilemma of either not responding to rocket attacks or responding and killing civilians. The goal of Hezbollah and Hamas is to maximize civilian casualties on both sides. That is, to develop rockets capable of killing as many Israeli civilians as possible and require Israel to kill as many Arab civilians, Muslim civilians, as possible. What I have recommended to the Israeli government, I've recommended this consistently, is that Israel ought to now reveal the location of these rockets and prepare a brief for the international community to be sent to the International Criminal Court, to the International Court of Justice, its allies, to the United Nations, saying, here's the situation we now face. There are 100,000 rockets aimed at us. The rockets are in civilian areas. That's part of Hezbollah and Hamas's policy. Tell us how to fight that war fairly. Don't give us a Goldstone report after the fact. Give us a pre-Goldstone report. Tell us how we can fight this war, how we can legitimately kill terrorists, legitimately hit the rockets, legitimately protect our civilians, knowing that there will be some civilian casualties inside. Tell us what to do. Don't complain after. Tell us before. If you tell us we can't fire, you will lose all your credibility, because no country will ever accept rockets being fired at its heartland. If you tell us that we can fire back, and we then do, if you tell us we should minimize civilian casualties, no country in the world has ever minimized civilian casualties like Israel. If you compare the United States and Israel, there is no comparison. The United States kills 10 times as many civilians per combatant as Israel does, and it may be even a higher number now with the drones in Pakistan. So right now, international
not for
combatants. Well, all right, we have different. I define. See, again, I think international law has and I even think my dear friend Aaron Baruch went a little bit too far in narrowing the definition of a combatant in asymmetrical warfare. I understand that. Reasonable people could disagree. But I use the word terrorist and combatant interchangeably. Now, just one more point, because I don't want to... The fascinating thing happened after the Goldstone report. I don't know how many of you know this. So the Goldstone report indicated that everybody that Israel killed were civilians. And the world was outraged. You know who was the most outraged? The citizens of Gaza. They were furious. They turned to their Hamas leaders and they said, why is this happening? Why are there no terrorists being killed? Why are only civilians being killed? Have you guys no bravery? Why are you putting us in harm's way? Why aren't you going out there and exposing yourself? So you know what Hamas did? It said the Goldstone report was wrong. The number of civilians killed was actually much lower. Most of the people killed were terrorists, were us, were combatants. Wow. So it's so interesting. how the public reaction, because we know what Hamas did. They built shelters for the terrorists. They wouldn't allow civilians into the shelters. They exposed the civilians. And so, you know, Hamas likes to use human shields, not so much the human shields. They don't like to be human shields. And so there was a lot of opposition to that as well. It's a complicated phenomenon, but international law has not served well, I think, in making these definitions, because the key to international law has to be pragmatism and reality. You have to allow a country to defend itself, and concepts like proportionality and minimization are nice in the abstract, but when you have a deliberate policy of putting rockets among civilians, it's very hard to implement that in practice.
Pnina was trying to say is one thing, what you can afford, we can't afford.
And what is legal is not always legitimate, so we are even judged even worse than
But what is legitimate is also not always legal.
Depends who asks the question.
But we haven't done it only for the international community. When I headed this committee with Professor Kasher, I was chief of the IDF colleges. And we have done it for ourselves, that we will know how to behave, how to act. Because at the end of the day, you have to look at your eyes in the mirror and say what I did was correct, was ethical, and maybe legal. But this is wasn't my area of expertise.
Right.
And I came to the idea that we have to look at it because of the Shahada issue. Shahada was an archi-terrorist in Gaza. And I was chief of the air staff in the Air Force when we planned to take him out. Because of not what he have done. He done a lot. He killed a lot of Israelis because what he will do in the future. And we know all the satanic terror operation that he planned. But when I was in the job, the rule was we cannot target him if there is civilians around me. Maybe one, but not more. But I left the job. I was promoted to the colleges. And one day, 6 o'clock in the morning, I listened to the news, and this guy was targeted, but with 15 civilians around it. It was an operational mistake. Nobody knew about it. If they knew about it, they would never target him. But there was a lot of criticism within the IDF, of course, within the IAF, Israeli Air Force. And I thought that we should have rules of engagement, ethical rules of engagement, because it is a tragic dilemma. A tragic dilemma. It's whether you are not defending your own people and the civilian on our side are killed by the terrorists, or you do what you have to do, your duty to protect the people of Israel, and you target the terrorist, and some innocent people around him may be killed. So on this tragic dilemma, you have to create some rules. And this is the reason why I sat with Professor Kasher, and we took the Harvard system, because we saw that there is no, the international law and the just war theory is not working here.
That's right.
And you have to adapt the old principles that were created in the 19th century for people with uniform who fighting people of uniform, and the civilians are not in the war, and there is equality between the two sides, and they are keeping the same rules. And here we come to a war which is asymmetrical in the fact that the terrorists, that's why I call them terrorists and not combatant, because they have no uniform. Right. They are in civilian clothes. They killing our civilians intentionally, and they shield behind civilians. It's a huge problem how to fight with them, with the old rules and the old ethical principle. And what we did, we brought commanders and lawyers and people who know ethics, and we created a committee, and we went case by case, trying to build from the case the theory, because this is what the good professors in Harvard are doing. For the whole semester, you have case study, and in the last class, they may give you the theory that come from out of all the cases. And this is what we come with certain principles how to evaluate ethically military fighting with terror. We don't have time to go to all the principles, but basically, I think by now the IDF is behaving very much like this
Right, I agree.
ethics, even though they were never formally approved. You know, 3 chiefs of staff in a row say that they like it, but maybe they were afraid of the lawyers to adopt it.
Let me very briefly relate the two subjects together because they're not unrelated. The need for preventive war or preemptive war sometimes, and the need to attack terrorists. Let me tell you why they're related. The reason Israel has to engage sometimes in preventive attacks, like in the Osiris nuclear reactor, was stated very clearly by Prime Minister Begin. He said because Israel does not believe in mutually assured destruction deterrence. Why? He said a nation of Holocaust survivors could never order the bombing of a civilian area and the incineration, as he put it, of 1 million Iraqi children. He said, quote, "We are not at war with the children of Iraq, and we could never order a pilot to drop a bomb on a city like Iraq." So because Israel cannot do what the United States did in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it has to have as one of its policies prevention and preemption, which are not civilian targeted. What is preemption? Think of the 67 war. The 67 war was a preemptive war in which the Air Force of Egypt and Syria were attacked on the ground with virtually no civilian casualties. Osiris, 1 civilian casualty. Syria, we don't know for sure, but none or a very small number of civilian casualties. There are dangers of preventive and preemptive war because they may happen too soon, they may happen when it wasn't necessary, but there are virtues to preemption and prevention in that they almost always target successfully only military targets. Whereas reactive wars very often have to target civilians. Now, you can't do that in Gaza or in Lebanon now. It's too late because the weapons are already in line, they're already in the homes. But I just wanted to relate the two together because there is certainly a close connection.
I think we ran out of time. I, of course, have answers. But we'll have to do that another time.
You can't talk about the peace process a little bit?
Okay, so if everyone is with us because and is ready to stay on for us, so I think we want to hear a little bit about the peace process. So we'll take some more minutes of your time because I see everybody is really interested in hearing what both of you have to say. Yes, about the peace process and a bit maybe also about the U.S.-Israeli discourse over the peace process.
Well, I am a very strong supporter of the Obama-Kerry process that's ongoing. I've known John Kerry since he's a young lawyer. I've known President Obama since he's a young law student. They desperately want to try to bring about a two-state solution. They are determined, dogged in trying to do it. I can't imagine a better time, from Israel's point of view, for making significant compromises toward peace. Now, remember that John Kerry has said, and this is a change of American policy. The American policy used to be they would never ask Israel to accept peace with the Palestinians that reduced their security. Kerry has now upped the stakes. He said he would never ask Israel to accept the peace process that didn't increase their security. So I think we can take security off the table. I don't think anybody is asking Israel to do anything that would reduce its security or endanger its security. People might think maybe ending the civilian settlements has something to do with security. I think it's the opposite. I think civilian settlements have been a disaster. I've been opposed to them since 1973. I think it's created tremendous confusion around the world over the term occupation. There's an enormous difference between a military occupation, which is legitimate, and which serves a purpose, and every country has had military occupations until there have been peace treaties, and civilian settlements, which serves no security interests, either in the short run or in the long run. You might argue that Israel's settlement policy has created facts on the ground, and nobody is going to give back the settlement blocks of Ariel and Etzion, certainly not Gilo and Malaya, Dumim, and any of those areas. Reasonable people could disagree about that. I think there's never been a better time for Israel to make political sacrifices, and that's what they would be. Political sacrifices, risking the coalition, risking support politically, domestically at home by changing its settlement policy and creating borders that are reasonable. Why is this the best time? Hamas has never been weaker. It's lost its support from Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood is on the decline. It's lost its Hezbollah is losing its credibility over its mistaken support. Of course, nobody knows which side Israel is on or should be on with the two devils in Syria, the devil we know and the devil we don't know as well but know fairly well. Israel is now have a common enemy along with Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, which would, I think, see in their own interest the possibility of having greater economic and military coordination. I think the Palestinian issue has made it so much tougher. The issue of continued civilian settlements and occupation has made it so much harder for Israel and the international community. I'm not saying this is a factor at all, but those of us who spend our lives defending Israel find it harder and harder to defend Israel in the face of settlements. I don't believe settlements are the major barrier to peace. I never have, but they are seen by the world as a major barrier. I will do everything in my power to try to push Israel into compromises. They will be painful compromises. Some people argue that life is too good in Israel, and maybe life is too good on the West Bank. If you've been to Ramallah recently, it's a thriving economic boom town. Maybe life's too good both on the West Bank and in Israel for either side to make what are painful, painful compromises. The Palestinians to give up their so-called right of return, their delegitimation of Israel, their claims at the ICC, Israel giving up territory, getting into a very painful situation of forcing settlers, as they did in Gaza, to no avail, to leave. Very, very difficult. But I think the time is ripe. I think it will increase Israel's leverage in relation to Iran. I take somewhat the opposite view of the Prime Minister, although I don't disagree with necessarily what he said. What he said is the Iranian problem and the deal make it a little harder for Israel to make peace because it increases the strength of Iran and therefore increases the likelihood that Iran might step in if there were a West Bank without Israeli soldiers, etc., etc. I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I would emphasize the other. I think that an Israel at peace with the Palestinians, and the Palestinians pose no existential threat to Israel, an Israel at peace with the Palestinians increases Israel's international leverage in trying to solve an existential problem, namely the Iranian problem. So I think from every point of view, I'm hopeful, and I hope that there will be a resolution with the Palestinians. 2014, as I said, will be an absolutely crucial year. Having said that, let me add one point. I am not an Israeli. I had an opportunity to become an Israeli 2 years ago when the Prime Minister offered me the great honor of serving as Israel's ambassador to the United Nations. I would have loved doing it. I would have enjoyed it as a culmination of my career. But as an American citizen, I have made the decision to live in America and to spend my time defending Israel in America. As a result of that, I don't have a vote. I don't have a veto. I don't even have a say. All I can do is express my opinion as someone who loves Israel, someone who strongly believes that Israel has been an incredible miracle. The idea, no country in history has ever contributed as much to the world as Israel in 65 years as Israel has, to medical technology, to high tech, to how to fight wars humanely, to human rights. No country has come close in 65 years to contributing as much. No country in the world faced with threats comparable to those faced by Israel has ever had a higher regard for human rights, a higher compliance with the rule of law, and more concern with civilian lives and protecting civilians from casualties. So I'm a tremendous admirer of Israel. I would never dream of telling Israel what to do, but I feel very strongly about the peace process and how I think the peace process, if it came to a successful culmination, would enhance Israel's security, enhance its legitimacy, enhance its international standing around the world. I think it's a win-win. I think it's a good thing. I think it's the right thing.
The tragedy is that we all know what will be the parameters of peace for the last 15 years. We all know that the Palestinians has to do 3 historical concessions, and the Israelis has to do 3 historical concessions. Let me list them very quickly. The Palestinians has to agree to end of conflict, finality of claims. This is the 2-state solution, that they recognize Israel as a state, and they recognize Israel, and they don't have more claims to continue the conflict. They have to accept that refugees will come back only to the Palestinian state, so no right of return to the state of Israel, and they have to agree to security arrangement. This is the 3 Palestinians' historical concessions. The Israelis has to agree to Palestinian state, 2-state solution, to accept it. They have to understand that it will be along the 67 borders with swaps with the main settlement block, and they will have to give the Palestinians presence in Jerusalem. Unfortunately, the 2 leaders, to my assessment, unable to do this in the coming future. And you can even see it with what you have started, the security arrangement. General Allen, a 4-star, very respected Marine general, created a security plan for Israel, and this is the easiest one that the Palestinians have to agree, and they rejected it. So I think we all should hope for America, that Kerry will always patient, and the 2 leaders will come to the level of historical decisions. But if we will not be able to reach an agreement, we should have a plan B. Bibi should plan a plan B, because we should not give the Palestinian veto about the character of Israel, the legitimate of Israel, the security of Israel, and the Jewishness of Israel. And if the Palestinians are not willing to come to agreement, we have to do it ourselves. How to do it? It's a long lecture. I will not start it in 9 o'clock, but you are invited if, and I hope that the negotiation will not end up in failure, but then the Institute will come with Plan B.
Okay. I just have one final word, if I can say that, and that is, I hate to end on this note, but it's absolutely essential. The lesson for me of Jewish history has always been that Jews believed for many millennia that our morality, our commitment to justice, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, our insistence on the right will save us. We have been proved wrong over and over again, from the Crusades to the Inquisition, to the pogroms, to the Shoah. And I think we have neglected one of the great phrases in the Psalms of David that we recite every day. Hashem oz le'amo yitain, Hashem yivarech et amo b'shalom. The Jewish people have learned that they need oz, that they will never have peace without strength. And the state of Israel has manifested that. The world has a very difficult time accepting Jewish strength, accepting Jewish oaths, accepting Jewish military superiority. Sometimes the Israelis have difficulty with that too, and as I think I share a view with you and with our distinguished prior speaker, that arrogance can sometimes be a function of strength. And Israel has great strength. And it should never give up its strength. I hear some of my friends on the hard left looking at strength as a vice. If strength is used to achieve peace, if oz is used to achieve shalom, there's a great virtue in strength. And nobody should ever ask Israel, of all the nations in the world, ever to compromise its strength. No country in the world needs strength more than Israel. No people throughout history need strength more than the Jewish people. So I praise the IDF. I praise the people who have devoted their lives to Israel's security. I learned a new word tonight from Pnina, that she says she's not a liberal or conservative. You're a mitchunik, a security person. I want to be part of that team with you. I think one can be a securitist and at the same time a peacenik. A securitist and a person who believes in justice. And I just hope and pray that Israel can maintain not only its strength physically and militarily, but its strength of character and its strength of determination to achieve peace.
Thank you. So thank you very much. It has been fascinating, and good night. Safe trip home. Hope it's not raining.
Thank you, Pnina. I'm sorry.
Thank you. That's so interesting. Thank you very much.
Sorry to disagree with you.